Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ASAE Great Pack webinar, International Association Policy and Legal Update, What Associations Need to Know. My name is Danielle Duran-Barron. I am the Vice President for Marketing Communication and Industry Relations at the School Nutrition Association. I'm also the Chair of Great Pack, the Government Relations and Advocacy Professionals Advisory Council at ASAE. This is the latest webinar in a series of Great Pack virtual sessions for association community. You probably have seen some of our other webinars, talk about everything, DEI, policy, pacts. This one, we're gonna take you around the world and give you a little, bit of insight of what's going on. So today's webinar features updates from association experts in Beijing, Brussels, and Washington, D.C. on the changing policy and legal landscape that impacts how associations do business around the world. From the war in Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, to new policies impacting everything from travel to sustainability. Governments and multilateral institutions have been active in shaping the environment for associations, especially those with global operations. Today, we'll hear about the latest developments, what should associations be doing in response, and what's coming next from our expert panel that I'm proud to introduce to you. So with us this morning, we have Jeff Evans, Director of Public Policy at ASAE. Good morning, Jeff. Alphonse Wittgest, board member at Kellen.
Morning.
Morning. Stephen Bazard, Vice President Asia for Kellen. Tommy Goodwin, Vice President for Exhibitions and Conference Alliance. Good morning, Tommy.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Oh, wonderful. We just have a few notes to begin. The session will be recorded and those who are registered will receive a copy. Folks who are here live will receive one CAE recertification credit. So for the duration of the talk, feel free to use the chat function to connect with each other, say hello, where you're dialing in from, add to the conversation, make a point. But if you have a question and you want to get an answer from our panel, please use the Q&A feature so that we'll get to it. And we'll try to get to as many of them possible towards the end of our time together. But let's begin now. We'll start from east to west, as my friend Tommy put it here on our script. So starting over, let's take you to China. And we're gonna hear from Kellen's Vice President of Asia and manager of its Beijing office. Hi, Steve. Can you tell us a little bit what's going on? Give us a brief update of what you're seeing over there.
Certainly, thank you, Danielle, and good day, everyone. Good evening from Beijing, China. As said, I'm Stephen Bazard. I'm the Vice President Asia for Kellen, based here in Beijing, China. So from across the Pacific, hi to everyone, or if you're in Europe, of course, across the continents, where a lot of things are happening, as we'll be exploring in this session today. So let me just first start out, if we can go to the next slide. I want to approach the topic from two areas. I'll be talking a little bit, of course, about China and Asia, and recognizing that I only have a few minutes and I could go on for hours. I will, of course, not be able to cover all grounds and all policies, but really tip on a few highlights that I think would be useful sharing today. And then, of course, with our panelists and later on with a few questions, we can tune in on a few more specifics that are relevant to our audience today. So I'll first start out with the China perspective, or with a few things from here in China, and then address a few things from a more regional perspective. So as we're looking at China, China has a clear global ambition in terms of manufacturing. If we're looking back to 2015, China initiated an industrial master plan called Made in China 2025. And it's really aimed at turning the country into a production hub for high-tech products over the next few decades. And according to the plan, the domestic market share of Chinese suppliers in core basic components or important basic materials is intended to increase to 70% by 2025. And as I said, the focus is on high-tech products. And therefore, the plan covers several sectors such as information technology, computerized machines, robotics, energy-saving vehicles, medical devices, as well as high-tech equipment for aerospace technology, maritime or rail transport. And really by investing billions of dollars, China has the ambitions to really turn itself into an industrial leading country by the target date of 2049. So that's a little bit of a far future prediction, but that's the ambition in terms of China becoming a global manufacturing leader. Now looking at or talking about policy trends in China, we cannot not talk about 5-year plans and their impact in terms of the 5-year plans on setting policies here in China. And just to give a little bit of historical context or background for those who are not familiar with China 5-year plans, it's really looking back at the earlier days of the People's Republic of China, where nearly all aspects of the market and the economy were planned through 5-year plans. These 5-year plans traditionally covered anything from what to produce, how many, at what pace, etc. And that was really in a time when 100% of the industries and the economy here in China were in whole or in part owned by the government. Now, fast forward to today, where 84% of the companies in China are privately owned and 80% of the Chinese jobs are created by the private sector. China calls itself a socialist market economy, where the market is said to be more of an important player in terms of allocating resources. However, this whole 5-year plan is still very much important, although since 2006, these plans are effectively no longer called 5-year plans, but more 5-year guidelines, because they now reflect more the fact that China is moving away from a fully planned economy to this socialist market economy, where really private companies have more of a role, yet there's still guidelines from the central government on how to prioritize and manage that. So these 5-year guidelines are more used for setting out priority areas that offer a direction on where to go, rather than the detailed route, as in the past, on how to get there. But they really remain an essential part of the overall governance of the country. So looking at today, we're currently in the 14th 5-year plan, which is covering the period of 2021 to 2025. So if we're looking a little bit at the 5-year plan, and of course we can spend hours talking about the details and the intricacies and nuances there, but zooming in on a few keywords on what type of keywords really are often or frequently used within the 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan. One keyword is, for example, dual circulation. Well, dual circulation, what does it mean? Some critics have interpreted this to mean that Beijing is really turning its back on the outside world. However, if we look a little bit closer on the plan, this may not necessarily be the case, but more, and this is also if we're looking at the interpretation from the government, it's more calling for unleashing the full potential of the domestic market and facilitating firms to provide high quality, good or better services to stimulate domestic demand. So no longer being fully reliant on only the outside world, but also really stimulating the domestic demand and creating more quality services. If we're looking at, or if we're listening to what the Chinese government is saying, they indeed constantly re-emphasize that it's not looking to decouple. It also continues to promise, and of course there are some side notes there, continue to promise opening up and offering greater access to foreign investors. And at the same time, they're also encouraging Chinese companies to trade more with the outside world. So again, China wants to continue, or says it wants to continue the opening up on a greater scale across more sectors and at a deeper level. But I'll share a few more perspectives on that, as well as some experiences from the business community later during our conversations today. So another term what we see a lot in the plan is innovation. The term innovation is actually mentioned almost 50 times, which is a lot. In the current 5-year plan, there's really a lot of emphasis on innovation, and it really shapes the heart, it forms the heart of China's future plans. China says it will strive to make major breakthroughs in core technologies in key areas, and it really has the ambition to become a global leader in terms of innovation. And we also see that in terms of policy pushes for higher spending in areas, emerging areas such as biotechnology, semiconductors, and new energy vehicles. Another term to really highlight here, which is interesting, that comes up a lot in the 5-year plan, is the focus on green growth. And it's a little bit of a sidetrack from where China previously in the 5-year plans was really very much focused on GDP targets, which sort of formed the KPIs for local government, and instead it's now emphasizing green growth. And it's a sign that Beijing or China, the Chinese government from the central government, is encouraging the local officials in the different parts of China to look beyond simply GDP and look at key performance as a key performance indicator, and instead focus also on low carbon and more sustainable growth models. And I think I can share also from our side as Kellen with some of our clients that we work with, some of the associations that actually are operating within some of these areas that are stimulated. And there are a lot of opportunities for initiatives in these areas, setting up dialogues and also being involved in, for example, standard setting processes when it comes to these high-tech and IT issues, biotechnology, etc. So at the same time, we also see that China, or rather Chinese companies, are seeking a more active role in some of our global industry associations, and perhaps someone on the call today has also some interesting cases to share in that regard. Maybe one last point before we go to the region here is to briefly touch on the business impact of the COVID-0 policy. And for some of you, you may be aware that over the past 2 years here in China, there's been a very strict zero COVID policy. And really for the period 2020-21, it's been very effective in keeping out the virus, and for substantial periods of time, keep large cities such as Beijing, Shanghai completely free and operational. However, whenever there was a local outbreak or a few incidental cases in an area, the zero COVID approach that China maintained really manifested itself in highly disruptive measures, and that had an extreme impact on companies operating throughout the country. And this year, those stringent measures are even been taken up a step further. Many of you may have heard, of course, of the mass lockdowns that happened in Shanghai as a result of the Omicron outbreak. And similar lockdowns actually happened across the country. So in certain parts like major manufacturing hubs in Shenyang, Jinan, or more liberal key cities such as Shenzhen over the border with Hong Kong. And even here in Beijing, we've been going through times where there have been strict measures that prevented us from going to the office, like many of you have experienced, of course, in the last 2 years. But there are different times in the rest of the world. One additional item to mention here is, of course, the geopolitical fallout of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and the fact that China is taking what itself calls quite a nuanced stance, but of course not openly condemning the actions that are happening by Russia there. And personally, I'm very much involved with some of the chambers of commerce here in China, so the European Chamber of Commerce and the American Chamber of Commerce. And this has very much led to a major concern from the business community where, for example, if we're looking at the most recent business confidence surveys from the European Chamber of Commerce, there's a lot of concern about the impact of the war and the stance that China is taking, as well as the stringent COVID containment measures that have been escalated in the past few months. And in fact, if we're looking at some of the key highlights, and I'm happy to, for anyone who's interested in some of these reports from the Chambers of Commerce, I'll share my contact information later. I'm happy to share that. But just to raise a few or highlight a few facts here, 3/4 of the members here in China of the European Chamber of Commerce have stated that the stringent COVID containment measures in this year have negatively impacted their operations. And of course, we all know that supply chains have really taken a pounding, and actually 92% of companies have been affected by the measures here in China, such as the recent port closures, decrease in road trafficking, road freight, I should say, and the escalating sea freight costs. So if I can just go to the next slide. And that's really taking briefly a more of a regional perspective. As said, the US trade war and the COVID-19 pandemic laid bare some of the needs for companies to look at diversity and supply chains outside of China. So I believe we went on to the next slide. If we can go back one slide. And this has given rise to a China Plus One strategy, what you may be familiar with many multinational firms now moving out to other countries in addition to China. And some of the Asian countries actually have put forward plans to attract overseas investments as companies look for other centers of production and distribution. So countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, all have introduced preferential policies for overseas firms that are investing in the country. So for example, Thailand has made strides in improving its ease in doing business, streamlining processes for obtaining construction permits, improving minority investor protection. Malaysia has also received an increasing amount of FDI, in part because the country has a strong legal system, but also high telecommunications and internet capabilities. Vietnam, of course, is near to China and has very much been a key part of many multinationals' China Plus One strategy, not only actually for Western firms, but interestingly also for Chinese firms. So there's a lot of China Plus One strategies coming from Chinese companies setting up shop or increasing presence in Vietnam. Side note there is, of course, that Vietnam's infrastructure is far behind from China, but China in that, or Vietnam, I should say, in that regard, is looking similar to China, really to step up on the transport infrastructure and has a master plan for 2030, actually, to improve the overall infrastructure in Vietnam. One note on India, and India has great plans to boost the digital manufacturing in the country and is actually developing a land which is spanning about twice the size of Luxembourg. Of course, Luxembourg is a small country, but is planning an area that's twice the size of Luxembourg to invite businesses that are looking for alternative locations to China. So from our perspective, working with associations that actually have an Asia-wide regional presence, we also see some of these sentiments echoed, and of course, particularly those that are working with strong supply chains or in manufacturing. To touch briefly on alliances and regional coalitions here, because it's really important to understand or be aware of the complexity of the relations between the various countries here in Asia, and that even is the case between some of the liberal democracies here in China. So alliances and regional coalitions are complex and dynamic for not only ideological reasons, such as with China. We also have factors such as regional clout. So of course, China and India are key examples of that, but historical reasons can also be very powerful in impacting bilateral relations, for example, between Japan and Korea. And for example, since 2011, the leaders of South Korea and Japan have not paid a state visit to each other. And that's very much stemming from the divergent memories that the countries have about Japan's colonial history in Korea. And while both countries are aware of some of, for example, some contemporary interests, such as the growing clout of China in the region, they share concerns about North Korea, of course. This past still very much keeps them divided. There is, in that regard, a small window of opportunity now coming along where Japan and Korea, and particularly their leaders, have stressed the importance of working together, particularly amid the ever more challenging regional environment that we're living on here in Asia. But more recently, also on July 4th, major business associations from both Japan and Korea held their first meeting again in 3 years. And these business associations also urged their political leaders to really make haste in repairing relations to counter some of these growing geopolitical issues and being able to support that on a bilateral level. As a last note here to touch on ASEAN. So ASEAN, of course, the Association of Southeast Nations, is a political and economic union between 10 member states of Southeast Asia. And it very much promotes intergovernmental cooperation in the area of economics, political, security, military, educational, etc. Interestingly, in 2020, ASEAN overtook the US in becoming China's greatest or China's largest trading partner. And particularly 6 of its member states, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia, account for almost 95% of ASEAN's total trade with China. And that importance of the ASEAN in China relations is also very much reflected with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi actually yesterday traveling to the Secretariat of the ASEAN in Jakarta, and kind of in response of the more recent efforts by the US and Europe to connect or to liaise with ASEAN to kind of counteract that. And he very much called out on those actions by saying that the ASEAN or the countries should not be used as a chess piece in global power politics. So I think that's maybe good to end up with maybe a last note that, of course, as a key achievement in terms of policy coming out of ASEAN was the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which took effect earlier this year in January 2022. And it's essentially the world's largest free trade agreement covering the ASEAN +3. So the ASEAN plus Japan, Korea, and China, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And really is a significant achievement for free trade, touches on important issues such as the rule of origin, IP protection, and tariff reductions. But of course, a very good element to highlight here in terms of current policy impacts in the region. So with that, maybe if we can go to the last slide. As I mentioned, I'm happy to share some of the more detailed reports from some of the chambers of commerce. There's a lot of content that I wish I would have an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours to talk about today. But I know that I'm seeing Danielle staring a little bit at me. Stephen, are you done with your conversation? So I'll end here, but please reach out to me if you want some further reports or information on that, or of course, drop your question in the Q&A. Danielle, back to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. No, there's a whole lot happening. Thank you for, condensing everything. But I agree. I think you could have spoken for 2 hours. There's a lot going on, and certainly lots of moving pieces. So thank you so much. And I see that people starting to put their questions in the Q&A. I see Ben just put one. So we'll get to you. So keep those questions coming. So now I'm going to move on to Europe and let Alphonse, a board member at Kellen based in Brussels, an ASAE fellow, share with us what's going on there and the latest developments on that side of the world. Thank you, Alphonse.
Thank you, Daniela, and good day to everyone. And if you move to the next slide, there's actually 3 topics. One is a short political agenda, then key policy, which is the green agenda for the EU, and finally a few notes on trade developments. So on the next slide, you will see a number of pictures, and here is why. As you probably know, President Macron was re-elected to the relief of many, but his party lost the majority. So now he's facing to form a difficult minority government this month. On the right-hand side, the Czech Republic, which takes its presidency as from this month for the next 6 months, is facing its own election during its presidency. Obviously, there's other countries having elections. There's 27 member states during any period of time. And as maybe everyone knows, Germany has a new path since the Merkel era is over. The center actually tries to explain that, and this is a picture from the G7, that Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, is still fully in charge and in the saddle until the end of 2024. So that's a major stability factor in Europe that you want to be aware of when you think about the political calendar. So on the next slide, a little bit more detail on what is happening in the area on the EU's green agenda, which was launched at the start of the Commission's 5-year term in 2019. It's now half time. We are halfway the 5-year term of the Commission. There's no election in between. There's also the 5 years of the European Parliament, which is at the same time happening. So what is happening is that the von der Leyen Commission had, of course, wanted to score a few goals at the start of the game, past the goals of China and the United States. And tactically, it was set up to focus on digital and green policies and to force rival regions to play on the EU's terms. In fact, despite the war in Ukraine, despite COVID, at Kellen and our associations that we manage, we have been extremely busy in the past years because the von der Leyen Commission has pushed forward relentlessly, particularly on the green agenda. And she hasn't done yet. She's not like a lame duck halfway, not at all. In fact, the German government has made it clear that it will not be insisting she gets a second term as head of the European Commission. So I don't think she will be holding back at all. The next picture, what we have here is the presidencies. So they're determined also to put the EU on a path towards climate neutrality. Also increasing economic competitiveness, job creation, and welfare. The picture on the left is actually one of the key agenda items, which is Fit for 55, has nothing to do with age, but rather to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. And it's in line with the Paris Agreement to try and limit the global warming to 1.5 centigrade. A next picture on this same slide is actually one of the key components of the Green Deal, which has an impact on associations dealing with and companies dealing with the EU. Because besides the emission trading system, the EU also is setting up a WTO-compatible carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that is really an important one if you are dealing with this. And the French presidency, still finishing end of June, reached an agreement on this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has as a main objective to avoid carbon leakage. In other words, it will also encourage partner countries to establish carbon pricing policies to fight climate change. And so it means that this piece of legislation will target imports of carbon-intensive products in full compliance with international trade rules, but at the same time to provide some measure of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions in return, and thereby not disadvantage those who manufacture in Europe. Some examples: cement, aluminum, fertilizers, electrical energy, iron, steel, and even food products will fall potentially under this mechanism. On the right-hand side of the slide, Repower EU. This was launched just last month in order to help rebuild Ukraine, hopefully when the war will finish in the foreseeable future, as an important priority over the next years. There is uncertainty, obviously, and the Czech presidency will take on the critical task of overseeing Europe's economic recovery around this, as well as the digitalization agenda. Repower was announced, and it has three main core goals. One, saving energy. Two, producing clean energy. And three, diversifying the EU energy supplies. And as we all know, with Russia able to tap off the gas, or sanctions imposed on Russia mean less oil and gas will be flowing to the EU. And thanks to the US and other partners, there are some backup measures being put in place. Last point on this slide is as an example of how the green agenda may impact some associations. We are quite involved at Kellen with the battery manufacturing and the European Battery Alliance and its battery innovation roadmap that Eurobat produced, the association produced. We also tried to pitch in for our services to see how Europe can become a global leader in sustainable battery production. And I say sustainable because, again, there will be all types of measures, as well as what's called a battery passport, really a battery passport, in order to track the origin and the life and the recycling of a battery in your car or in an energy system. I know the US is also picturing energy and batteries as a field of consensus or dissensus, discontent, whatever you want to call it, as you're facing in the US a number of areas of disagreement or court cases outcomes. On the next slide, a different picture, which is about the trade agenda. And I'll cover three areas here. The first one is the fact that trade remains one of the most powerful engines of EU's growth. And in fact, already last year, the European Union proposed that WTO needs to be reformed. There will be bilateral trade agendas, but at the same time, Europe believes and the European Union believes that the WTO can help to ensure that unfair and abusive practices will discontinue. This is a long-term agenda item, but it's actually back on the agenda, and I think that's good. But for associations, it will be an area to watch. The second one, who could have, I would say, forecast the exact date of when Boris would resign or be forced to resign? But clearly in the last few days, the question was, will the European Union rub its hands with glee at his downfall? Yes, but also no. And actually, you can quote something from the BBC that was kind of interesting. So when asked by journalists if any extra bottles of champagne had been ordered in response to the news of Boris' resignation, an EU spokesman dryly responded, "We have a very limited consumption of alcoholic beverages in the Commission." In fact, a lot will depend on the next 2 months, who will succeed Boris, and if there will be change. The graphics are a little bit thin to watch, but the bookmakers' favorite is someone named Rishi Sunak. However, it's still a very open race. For 2 months, we've scheduled to find out, will the EU and the UK be better off or worse off after Boris Johnson? And I mean that in the case of trade and collaboration. Clearly, there's collaboration about Ukraine, but on trade, and particularly Northern Ireland, we still have a lot of issues to build up. Finally, a bilateral important development that the EU and India kickstart an ambitious trade agenda. And it's, as Stephen said, India is a major economy, although it's still tiny compared to China, the EU, and the US, but it has a major potential, and clearly everyone is watching that. So the first round of negotiations was happening actually last week, and the two sides agreed to fast-track the talks with the aim of concluding them by the end of 2023, so end of next year. And this is important because bilateral, contrasting that with my first point on WTO, will remain an important force. And Stephen pointed to that as well. And I'm actually curious to hear at some point how the US is looking at that on the bilateral or the more global trade agenda. For food, India is important. India is very dependent on import of fuel. So there's many issues that will play around before that deal can be concluded. That is what I wanted to say as an introduction. And maybe in the next slide, there's the contacting details in case you want to contact me as board member or my successor as managing director, Maria Teresa Scardigli, since the 1st of this year, or Nele de Volder, that some of you may know also, because she's actively dealing with a number of US associations investing in the EU. Thank you. Back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Alphonse. Thank you. That was fascinating. Yeah, lots of things going on your side of the world. Now I'm going to pass it on to Jeff, who's going to bring us home to the US and is going to give us a brief policy and legal issues overview with a focus on association operations. So off to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Appreciate your time. There is certainly a thing or two happening in the US. I imagine folks have seen much of it on television and in the news. I'll try and be as concise as possible, but that can be difficult talking about such heavy issues. But firstly, I'd like to cover some of the priorities ASAE has in the public policy arena. You know, associations, as we know, do quite a bit to support our constituent communities. Education, career growth, standard setting, you know, the list goes on. And so much of that activity takes place in events, during events, you know, annual meetings, things of that nature. ASAE has its annual meeting in 5-ish weeks, which is basically tomorrow. I know Danielle is in the midst of her annual meeting, so these events are important. And that's how I frame this issue around events to staff in Congress, because associations, again, do a lot, and so much of what they do is focused within those events. And I talk about events in this post-esque COVID world. We're not quite past it, especially with these new variants that pop up, but it's certainly a different world than it was 2020, 2021. And what we need now is coverage for those important events. Because on average, an association has about 35% of its budget tied into major events. And without coverage, because the insurance market since COVID has receded for that type of insurance. So without that coverage, associations would be on the hook for on average 35% of their budget if something bad happened to their events, i.e. a pandemic. So what we've been doing is working with some coalitions, a lot of offices on the Hill, particularly in the Senate now, about establishing some sort of program. It's not going to be easy, whatever might come down the pike, but we're in the process of trying to coalesce to associate policyholders and insurers, because to insure, to cover for losses amid a pandemic is certainly not a small endeavor, but we can get there. And it's just been a matter of trying to demonstrate to stakeholders on the Hill, and also insurers for that matter, how important these events are, not just to the host organization and their ability to pay staff, invest in their constituents, but also local economies. On average, ASAE for its annual meeting, its 5-day annual meeting, injects $16 million into a local economy. And that's just during the 5 days, and is to say nothing of downstream return on investments. And ASAE has a decent sized annual meeting, but it's certainly not the biggest. So we are talking about very much macroeconomic numbers here. And that's what I try, and what we try to bring to the Hill as often as possible. Because again, without that coverage, associations putting on average 35% of their budget on the line is an extremely difficult thing to justify. And now without the coverage, even if it is tough to justify, it's a decision that unfortunately probably has to be made. And organizations are constantly, balancing, do we just go forward with an event, full throttle? Do we truncate it? Do we not do it at all? And when that starts to happen, the stakeholder communities, the industries, the professions, and the local economies are harmed. So we're trying to find a solution for that. Moving quickly to some of our other priorities, those are around workforce development, specifically credentials, professional certifications, things like that associations dole out. Excuse me. As subject matter experts for a various sector of the economy, associations, as we all know, are the the provider of these seals of demonstrated expertise, experience, skills, all of that. So we've got a tandem list of priorities right now. There's a bill, I'm sure a lot of you on this line have heard me talk about it before, but it's the Freedom to Invest in Tomorrow's Workforce Act. And what that would do is expand 529 education savings plans. Those are tax favorable savings plans that people can use right now for a few things, but primarily a 4-year degree. And it would expand these tax favorable programs to include costs associated with credentialing, specifically exams, certification, recertification exams, things like that. And it would not only help people pursue certifications, but also broaden access to 529s and make that a little bit more equitable, because to use 529s now toward a 4-year degree, you have to have a decent amount of financial resources to set aside. A rule of thumb I've heard before is $400 a month per child per year of college. So, you know, if you've got 2 kids, that's quite a bit of money. Whereas a certification might be under $1,000, much more feasible. And therefore it would expand that access, make it a little bit more equitable. Our other priority in regard to workforce is this proposal that is still pending, hasn't yet been introduced. It's close, just putting some of the finishing touches on it. And it would be aimed to help people who have been hit hardest by COVID from a financial and workplace standpoint. So for folks right now, this is still shifting, but for folks who have been displaced from their jobs in the last 2+ years, have gone through the unemployment insurance program, they would be eligible for a free, reduced cost up to 95% off of a certification program. And, you know, there's some behind the scenes work with the government in terms of how that's paid for. That's still being ironed out. But that would be extremely helpful for the individual. It would inject talent into that community, whatever industry, whatever profession. It would obviously help the certifying organization. But what it would also do is coalesce a list of legitimate skills training and certification programs that exist in the whole workplace ecosystem. And that would be listed on a federal database. And that resource, that tool, would be beneficial not only to the individuals receiving benefits through the program, but any American or any person who wanted to see what sort of opportunities existed out there. And it would have contextual information, how long it takes to achieve the certification, how much it costs, outcomes, if those exist. And so we think that would be extremely valuable to the workforce at large. And associations, this is stating the obvious, but we exist to support industries and professions, thereby the workforce, thereby the economy and society. So we feel that focusing on those 2 issues, the event insurance, the 2 things with workforce, that leans into what we are meant to do and is helpful to demonstrate to lawmakers that point exactly. And quickly, I'll just wrap to give a little bit of my sense on the midterm elections, how Congress might look starting next year. And this is, again, more of stating the obvious, but I would imagine that the House of Representatives will flip to Republicans, even before inflation, things like that. The dynamics were leaning their way. Inflation is still just such a powerful facet of this whole equation. And while the Supreme Court cases will certainly invigorate parts of the Democratic base, I'm not convinced that that's going to be the thing that stands in the way of Republicans taking the House. The Senate, however, is a different story. I think Republicans are less confident in their prospects than they were maybe 2-3 months ago, but that is an extremely fluid position. Obviously, the presidency would still be President Biden for 2 more years after this election, but it could be quite a different makeup on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. And I forgot to introduce you as, the winner of the Association Top 21 in 21 honoree and the 2022 Association Trends Leading Association Lobbyist. So you have a lot of kudos. Oh my God, that's very impressive.
Thank you so much.
We do have 2 questions for you, but we're going to hold to the end. but just get ready. So I just want people to know that we're reading their questions and we're going to get to them as soon as we can. But now with that we've been taken all over the world, I'm going to pass it on to Tommy, who is going to talk about international travel policies. I'm sure everybody's very interested and the sanctions on Russia. So Tommy, please take it away.
Danielle, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. As Danielle mentioned, some of the international and legal issues that are impacting the association community are very cross-border and cross-cutting in nature. And these are issues that cross geographic boundaries and have different implications and impacts depending on the country or region we're talking about. So let's start with international travel. As Danielle mentioned, on the U.S. side, there was a significant development last month in that fully vaccinated travelers who are coming to the United States are now no longer required to take a pre-departure COVID test. We were finding in research that this was significantly impacting both business and leisure travelers, vaccinated business and leisure travelers from some of the top markets that bring visitors to the US from coming over. I think it was Morning Consult had a poll that it was about 46% of surveyed international visitors found the pre-departure testing to be a real significant impediment to coming back to the US. And so that, with that off the table now, I think it's easier for folks from the countries who do not require a visa to travel to the US, obviously to make it over for US association activities and events and the like. But there are challenges remaining when it comes to inbound travel to the US, and that really primarily centers on visa interviews and processing challenges. As of right now, if you look at some of the countries where the most frequent visitors pre-pandemic were coming to the US for both business and leisure travel, so think Mexico, Brazil, India, Colombia, Israel, China, and others, on average right now, it takes a little bit more than a year to get a visa interview appointment. Not just get a visa itself, but to get an interview at an embassy or consulate around the world to be able to begin the visa process to come to the US. And what that means is really, US-based activities are still closed for a lot of members of associations that have a global footprint. And this is impacting event attendance, the ability for volunteer leaders to come over for board meetings, and a whole variety of other activities. So while the travel into the US situation is certainly getting better, there are still some challenges on the horizon, and I don't think we're going to see that smoothed out to pre-pandemic levels for quite some time. Now, the situation, I think, is varied abroad. I think we see around the world different protocols, different policies and the like in different countries, depending on where you are. In Canada, for example, our neighbor to the north, we know that, the country remains open for vaccinated and recovered travelers, but there are some fairly stringent policies in place for those who are unvaccinated. In Europe, you've got 30 countries at this point that have no COVID-related policies in place, Germany, Italy, UK, and others. But for other countries, there are different provisions. France is one that has different rules in place depending on where travelers come from. The Netherlands, it's vaccinated or recovered only if you're coming from outside of the EU, and even to get into Spain now, it's proof of vaccination, recovery, or a negative test to make it in. So I think it's really important for associations who have a large international audience, who bring a lot of members over for events from abroad, just to continue to monitor these changes and continue to communicate not only with your members, but also with your volunteers and staff who are responsible for planning meetings, doing events, board activities, and the like. It is really, I think, absolutely critical. And then there are obviously other places around the world that have different policies. Stephen, I may ask you to kind of come in and provide an update on what that looks like in China, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Tommy. From the China side, as said, there's still a COVID-0 policy in place, and particularly for inbound travel. Anyone trying to enter into China is still subject to mandatory central quarantine, which means you spend 7 days at this point in a quarantine facility or up to 10 days with an additional 3-day home quarantine. So this is unlike, of course, many of the quarantines that have happened in the US and Europe, which, if they were even enforced, were usually at home. Here it is in a central facility. Luckily, it is a step down from half a year ago. And I can speak from personal experiences. When I flew back from Europe to China in February of this year, I spent 21 days going through a mandatory central quarantine in Xiamen in order to return afterwards for a 7-day quarantine at home in Beijing. So a month passed by before it was free again. So there's improvement there. Many other East Asian nations, if we're looking at Japan, Korea, are looking at improving the policies, but even Taiwan, Hong Kong are still very much enforcing quarantine requirements, although much shorter compared to mainland China. Southeast Asia is a little bit more open. So Singapore, if you are vaccinated, you're able to travel into the country even without quarantine. But I think it's really important to be aware of, if you are planning or if you're considering exploring travel to this region, to think about or look into what the quarantine requirements are, but also be aware, of course, that even though your members may be able to travel to your annual meeting in the US, from a US perspective, if it means that they would have to go through these quarantine requirements coming back into China, there will be a lot of hesitation. Apart from the fact of the quarantine, right now flights are very, very expensive due to limited seatings, etc. So that's, I think, an update from my side of the world, Tommy.
Stephen, before we move on, we have a question here, and I'm afraid we won't get to it. Ben asks if China's rethinking its zero COVID policy in light of recent reports of economic slowdown. What have you heard?
Yes and no. I think it's really hard to read the tea leaves, the proverbial tea leaves, of course. Officially, it's no longer a zero COVID policy. There's a nuance now that it's formally called a dynamic zero COVID policy. So there's a dynamic edit to the zero COVID policy, but it still very much means that cities, if there is, of course, a case that are very strict requirements, people are taken to central quarantine, etc. At this point, there is a lot of push and lobby from the chambers of commerce. So I mentioned before the European Chamber, the American Chamber, because there is a lot of concern from the business community. On the bright side, I did mention that very recently, over the past few weeks, the quarantine requirements were very rapidly scaled down from 21 days to 14 days and now to 7+3 days, which really is a result from the lobby that the chambers of commerce have done here. In addition to that, there is a circuit break requirement for flights still in place, that any flights into China that have cases on board, if there are more than 5 cases, the flight will be suspended for 2 weeks. If there are more than 10 cases, the flight will be suspended for a month. In addition, there have been very, very limited number of flights into the country. And there's a little bit of a bright light on the horizon as well, that we really very much in the last 2 to 3 weeks see basically on I would say on a weekly basis, additional flights being confirmed. Beijing had actually recently accepted its first international flight from Abu Dhabi again. And I just saw that Air France also confirmed that they will start flying from Paris to Beijing again later this month. So there is some bright news on the horizon, but I think, in terms of really getting rid of the full COVID zero policy, no one's expecting anything to happen before the end of this year, since of course, the top leader here in the country will be re-elected here later this year. Before that, this is his policy, his personal stamp is on it, and there's no chance, at least most of us think no chance that it will be changing before that. Hopefully in the next months after that, the following months, but it's very uncertain at this point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stephen, that's excellent. I want to bring up one other cross-cutting issue before I turn to my fellow panelists here, and that is the issue of sanctions. I think we know that there have been a wide range of sanctions adopted following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on both Russia and Belarus, by the United States, the UK, the EU, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, Japan. There have been quite a few countries who have put in a pretty large portfolio of sanctions on Russia in particular. The EU, I know, has adopted 6 separate rounds of sanctions. I believe in the US, at last check, we're slightly above 40 different sanctions announcements from both the White House and the federal agencies. And there's a variety of different sanctions involved. There are financial measures, so decoupling Russian entities from payment systems, certain provisions around debt repayments. There have been different industry restrictions, use of military goods, airspace, targeting individuals who are associated with Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, and different other types of bans. I bring these up because they're obviously far too numerous to go into today, but I think it's important for the associations on the call to recognize that quite a few of these sanctions do have what's called extraterritorial scope. which means they're due to be implemented regardless of where an organization does business in the world. So, if I'm an association and Jeff, for example, is a member and we are in another country that doesn't necessarily have sanctions regimes in place, those sanctions are still adherent that are put out by the US, EU, UK, and others. So I think associations do have to be very, very careful to adhere to those sanctions no matter where they are. But I also think it's important to point out that while many countries have put sanctions into place, far more haven't. And this has the potential to create some both operational and compliance challenges when operating in those countries. I think there's a difference between some of the sanctions that have extraterritorial impact versus other just sort of standard business practices. And one of the things that I've been thinking of lately is many different associations had put out some restrictions on banning events in Russia, restricting Russian members from taking part in association activities. And in the countries where you do have those sanctions in place, that's pretty easy to implement, but those can really be unenforceable in some countries. And I'll kind of give an example, not from the association side, but just in general, from the trade show side, which is, my industry that I represent. There are examples of, trade show organizers on the commercial side who were, putting on events in third countries that didn't have sanctions, that were trying to restrict people from certain countries who were told in no uncertain terms by those countries that was against the law there. And so, there's a balance between the activities that your association has put into place and how you're guiding your own operations versus what's permissible in certain countries. So I think associations do really need to be aware of the on-the-ground operating environment in all the countries that they're engaged in. And that may lead to some very, very tough sessions that are tough decisions that are required, where some of those internal association policies kind of meet the on-the-ground business environment. And just a brief plug, at the ASAE annual session, we're going to be doing a session on kind of longer-term international challenges, and that's one of the issues we're bringing up is how do you balance the moral and legal implications of various policies. So if you're going to be in Nashville, please join us for that. But those are certainly two issues top of mind. But Alphonse, I know we recently kind of talked about some of the operational issues abroad, and maybe I'll turn to you for a moment to chat a bit about that.
Yeah, just in a minute, and we may spend or organize a seminar or webinar on this, Tommy and colleagues in the international domain, is the increased difficulty to comply with local legislation, government supervision, of non-government organization laws, compliance with that. And it's not just China or a particular country, but I know cases where European associations were trying to set up in the US and faced a number of different areas and questions. Clearly, everyone should support anti-money laundering. But if you look at banks, the number of questions you get to even open a bank account, is there ultimate business owner of an association and their boards? It's pretty endless at the moment. And at Kellen, we are able to navigate that. But boy, you can imagine how difficult it is if you want to set up even just a bank account overseas. Gone are the days that was, go to visit and open a bank account. So I think I'll leave it at that because we're at the top of the hour now, but something that we would look into in the next session, I think. Back to you, Danielle, or?
Yeah, I think we're coming up. Actually, we're past a few minutes, so I want to thank everyone, thank our panelists, and thank everyone for joining us today. Also wanted to let you know, we hope to see as many of you as possible in Nashville for ASAE annual meeting, the first one face-to-face one in 3 years. So we're super excited about that. We have 2 GR sessions at a meeting, and they'll feature some of our Great PAC members, how state and local legislative regulatory advocacy can build association value. Some of them are actually on the chat. I saw them, Sherry Whitworth, Tyler Craddock, and Jim Call. This is on Monday, the 22nd from 4 to 5. And the other one is doing it differently, disrupting your GR efforts to generate ROI with David Lusk, Carmen Elliott, Oyoung Gosnell, and yours truly on Sunday, August 21st from 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. And Tommy doesn't want me to tell you, but he's also doing a session looking over the horizon, the future of global associations. That's on Monday, the 22nd from 2:30 to 3:30. So if you're in Nashville, we certainly hope to see you there. But with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing their wealth of knowledge and expertise. It's always great to hear from you. I think they have left their contact details. And I know if you want to follow up with them, get more detailed information on anything that's going on, US side, Europe or Asia, they'd be happy to share that with you. Thank you, Tommy, Alphonse, Jeff, Stephen, and Mary Kate. Wishing everybody a great day. And with that, I think we'll close. If our panelists want to say a few words. You're good?
Just thanks and take care, everybody.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.